Hey, Bomb Squad. If you're a comedian or a podcaster looking for an affordable website solution with a modern look, then we recommend Puck's Hub. With a Puck's Hub website, you can set up your new website in minutes with easy-to-use pre-built templates. Puck's Hub websites are customizable and can easily be integrated with other platforms like Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter. The best part? Puck's Hub plans are only $5 per month. We use Puck's Hub for our website at the Art of Bombing podcast, and we think you should too. That's why we've partnered with Puck's Hub to offer listeners a free 60-day trial. Head over to puckshub.com to subscribe and use promo code AOBPOD at checkout for your 60-day free trial, and then pay only $5 per month after that. Take your career to the next level with your own Puck's Hub website today.
Dan Bublitz Comedy Productions.
My friend Dan, he's got a podcast, 'cause all comics need a podcast, and nobody had a podcast called The Art of Bombing. So Dan went out and bought a tape deck. Who knows why he bought a tape deck? Podcasts don't get played on tape decks, but Dan is from the 80s. So hey there, all you funny jerks, come talk to Dan about your work. Tell him all about your worst times. It's The Art of Bombing.
Welcome to an all-new Art of Bombing presents Between Bombs, where Josh and I call back the most recent episode. In this week's episode, we are calling back episode 282 with my good friend Nathan Hults, who I believe made his fourth appearance on the podcast, and he was pretty excited about that.
Yes. Yeah, I was. I think... Isn't most of the episode about that?
I feel like a lot of it is. It was, and it was kind of a last minute recording. It wasn't like planned. He happened to be passing through. He was crashing at my house, and I was just like, we were gonna hang out, and I was like, you know what? Why don't you're here? Let's whip out an episode. And he was like, heck yeah. And so we did. So yeah, a lot of it we talked about that. There was still some good stuff that came up in the episode, you know, where you can really get some wisdom and insight from.
He's got great stories, you know. I think it just the fact that he's been on 4 times and had different stories each time, you know, just he's an adventuring comic like a lot of us. He's on the road, a lot of great stories. So, and
he's good at telling stories too.
Yeah.
He's got a good storytelling presence.
Yes. Yeah, I like that. I feel like the episodes are always stronger when we have like a good storyteller, because you get
absolutely, you
get involved. And there was a couple of things that I heard him say, just at least that sort of came up that I thought, you know, were worth discussing. And so one of the things, and this is kind of a lighter topic, but you know, sometimes, and he mentions this in one of his recollections, that you're going to have to share the stage with newer comics sometimes.
Yep.
It's interesting, right? It kind of adds a dynamic that I thought we hadn't really talked about much.
Yeah, no, we really haven't. And that's true. I mean, that is something you have to, in comedy, you will have to do is, you know, like you said, share the stage with newer comics, especially when you're touring and you go to like a smaller town. Like in his situation, he was talking about performing at, I believe, Grand Junction, or not Grand Junction, but just outside of Grand Junction. He was in Delta. And, you know, he's not, especially when you're touring alone. That's the other thing, because then you have to rely on the comics that are in those areas. And some areas don't have strong comedy scenes. Like the bigger cities.
Yeah, you know, you're right. You can't just get, you know, a lot of times a feature to just kind of follow you around. So you go to, and you work with what's there. And if there's not a scene where people are able to get reps and really kind of carry a comic career, and, you know, and even if they do, a lot of times those people aren't there because there's not much of a scene there. So you kind of have to just double down on what's available. And, it can be interesting. I've had situations like that where I am just not really able to, or I don't hear that there's any crowd work that's being done, right? Like, so nobody's working on the audience, and so that puts pressure on the experienced comics to bring the room together. Just lots of dynamics like that you have to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. How do you feel about working with new comics when do you have an opinion? Is it you're happy to, or is it you're kind of hesitant, or it is what it is?
I'm happy to, but I would prefer most of the time not to work on a show where the lineup is mostly newer.
Yeah.
Comics,
Yep.
right.
Yep.
Like, because when that
maybe
happens,
you have a guest spot that's a newer comic, maybe 2 guest spots, but not the whole show.
Yeah, agreed. Like, yeah, because newer comics need a shot. We were both newer comics at one point, and we needed to do a little bit of time, and that's important.
It is, absolutely. And I think that is important. And that's something I think not even just like newer comics, I think is great though for like when like headliners like who get booked at comedy clubs, and instead of bringing their own people, they choose to have the club book locals. I think is great because they're providing those opportunities for those scenes.
Yeah. Yeah. So as long as I have been on some where it's like it's like 4 or 5 newer comics, and then you go, and I will, wow, especially if like you can see that there's an invested crowd, and this isn't the case for all new comics, but I've been on some shows where we kind of stack these newer comics at the beginning of the show when the crowd's really leaning forward and they're fresh and they're listening, and we kind of lose them in the process. Which can happen, but and we've talked a lot. Hopefully, if you are a newer comic and you want to learn more, get better, listen to this podcast.
Yeah, go back, listen to all the episodes. There's a lot of great insight on that. Another thing, and this is kind of a good lead-in because when you're traveling, you get you perform with people, and and then the longer they do comedy, the longer you do comedy, there's a good chance your paths cross again. And sometimes when you perform, and I don't know if this has happened to you specifically, I'm trying to think, I'm sure it's happened to me where, sometimes the same person sees you more than once and they never see you at your best.
Yes. And Nathan talks about that in the show. Like that was kind of the conjoining factor on the 2 stories that two of the stories that he was telling, which are hilarious. And by the way, if you haven't gone back to listen to the show, we're going to give you a chance right now to do that.
Okay, now that you've listened to the show, now we'll continue.
You know what we're talking about, exactly. So this
now you have the context.
You have the context for what we're going to talk. Yeah. So so when he said that, I was like, oh yes, that's like exactly what I've been through before. I mean, I can definitely just name people who are like, yeah, that guy sucks at comedy. Like, and you want to have who say that about me specifically, right?
Yeah,
like,
I know what you mean.
Because
I know what you
just
mean.
Never.
Yeah,
I've just never done well for that, and you just kind of have to reconcile with the fact that happened, especially if you've done something that I've done, which is really dumb, which is invite a bunch of your friends to see you perform when you're less than a year into comedy, and then they don't come back to like see you again after that because they've kind of cemented in their minds that you're not good.
Yep, that definitely happens. I mean, that's obviously bad, but I always think it's worse, at least in my opinion, when that same thing happens, but with other comedy bookers and producers, where, you perform on a show and other comics are on there and you do bad, and then you work with them again and you still do bad. And so now their perspective of you is you're a bad comic.
Yeah. Exactly. Like that's,
and then they don't want to put you on their shows.
That's right. That's unfortunately, sometimes bookers and people who run shows have that opinion of you that just isn't really accurate. I think you kind of have to just stay strong in your own self-image and kind of understand that on one hand, comedy and your ability to do it does not define you
Mm-hmm.
and
I
your
think
self-worth.
to add on to
Yeah.
that, I think you're right, and you just have to let some things go.
Mhm.
Well, when you have those situations, does that mean you'll never perform in one of their rooms? Maybe, but chances are, if you just keep, if you're persistent and you keep, working on your comedy and getting better, eventually they're going to see you do well. If
Right.
if it's somebody that you run into frequently, and
Yeah.
then you will get on that show, but it may just take you a little bit longer if you keep performing terribly in front of that booker.
Right. But and to kind of, I guess one thing that can be under your control, like, and we are talking about something right now, if you're an established comic, especially, it's not necessarily under your control. But what is under your control, especially if you're newer, is that you can choose where you perform. And
Mm-hmm.
if you're newer, get consistently good and then go get seen, right? It
Yep.
might be too early to try to break into some places for you, and you have to just reconcile with that.
Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, and then, another thing I think we should talk about that from that conversation that I thought was really good is that Nathan does a lot of corporate gigs.
Right.
He does do, he'll do clubs and little one-nighters and stuff, but I think a lot of his work comes from doing corporate comedy. And he's done pretty well for himself where, he has pretty high standards and, charges pretty high and still gets booked. And I think, it's probably because of his reputation, as booking himself for corporate comedy.
Yeah. Yeah. And what struck me in the episode, or what I started thinking about, was like the actual setting up of corporate gigs. Like,
Mm-hmm.
you can take for granted that because you're going to you know get somebody's HR department or events coordinator or enablement person is going to write you a check, that they know how to put events on and
Mm-hmm.
how to get the most out of right. Even if they know events, like, they might not understand the difference between music and a musical act and a comedian.
No,
And I think,
absolutely. I think comedy gets lost on a lot of people
right,
when it
yeah, that
comes
it can
to
be an
event planners.
ambient, like, oh, this can just be happening tonight. It
Yep.
what I mean, you've told a story a few times on the show that's just golden, where, like, I won't tell it for you, or anything, but like you were the victim of a classic victim of somebody not planning a corporate gig properly, and it didn't work out for the audience or for you
Yeah.
on
And
that.
in that situation, I take full responsibility in the sense that I'm the one that planned that poorly because, I didn't ask enough questions. And I think that's something we've definitely covered on this podcast in regards to corporate gigs and setting up your own shows and things like that. You need to ask questions. You have to ask questions and have a guide. And it's a lot of work, really, to do corporate gigs, not just because of the gigs could be one way or another, but there's a lot that goes into the setup. You have to have conversations with the person booking you and make sure they know that comedy isn't the same as like just playing music, and that it takes there's certain elements that you need to make it successful and things like that. And that's part of your responsibility as booking yourself, is to get all those details hashed out and then into a contract. So when you show up, if something isn't right, you can say, hey, a contract says this, you didn't do it. You could still do the show, but now you can say, hey, I think we need to renegotiate pay, or I'm not going to do as much time. There's some, you have room for negotiation. And hopefully that doesn't happen. Hopefully what happens is if you're booking yourself to do corporates, you have enough foresight and forethought to ask all the right questions, get everything planned out appropriately, and then when you show up, it's easy peasy. You go in, do your set, collect your check, go home, happy camper.
There you go. That's, can you think of a few things that, like, you would have, or maybe even better, Dan, like you said, you didn't ask enough questions. Like, what were the questions you wish you would have asked? Like, for anybody listening who might be walking into a corporate buzzsaw. Like, how do they?
Oh yeah. Well, after that,
Sorry.
because again, this is stuff you learn through experience, or if there's somebody teaching classes on this kind of stuff, don't hesitate to think about doing a class. I don't know. I don't think he still teaches anymore, but Rick Roberts, who has been a guest on the show, used to teach comedy classes, and he even did stuff specifically for corporate comedy and the business side of comedy. But prior to that, with experience, some of the stuff, like if I was going to get booked for that same gig or any kind of a gig like that, where it's a conference and I would first, I want to know, I would ask what kind of ceremony it is. If if it's an award ceremony, how long they think they're going to be, how long it's going to last, how many awards are they giving out? And especially now, it'd be like, is there any memorials taking place?
Is there a moment where everybody gets really sad tonight?
Yeah, is there, besides when I'm telling jokes, is there a moment when everybody gets really sad? Other things you might want to ask, if it's a holiday party, consider asking if they're going to be giving prizes, what time dinner is. Are you performing before dinner, but in dinner, during dinner or after dinner? Is dinner being served? Are they ordering it, service to the table? Is it buffet style? All these things, because then you can then put, form it so that you're performing in the most pristine time. And personally, for me, I don't mind performing during the dinner, because I feel like if you wait till after dinner, then they start getting tired and sleepy. But if it's a buffet style dinner, I prefer to wait till after everybody's been through the line at least once. Once everybody's been through the line and sitting down, starting to eat, then you can start the show. And again, that's just my personal preference. There's other comics that don't want to perform while people are eating. But that, because they're busy doing this and not necessarily listening and I get that. But I also think when they're full, they're not listening either, because now they start getting sleepy. That's just going from my own personal experience as somebody who loves food.
Yeah. I think you're something you said that I thought really stood out was timing. And I'm about to go do a corporate gig in a couple of weeks, 3 weeks in Redwood City. And so all these different things are on my mind. Like you don't want to be doing comedy during something else. Now, during dinner, you're not necessarily competing with another source of entertainment, or you're not necessarily performing at a time where there's a lot of distractions other than food. They are going to be eating. That could stifle some of the laughter. A lot of comics would say they prefer not to do that, but still, that's better than, like you said, doing it afterwards whenever they're tired. Or dinner could be 2.5 hours long, depending on what they're doing.
Exactly.
Award shows, all these different kinds of things. And so so if we were to just look at like, what's the ideal scenario? Everybody's watching a comedy show. Everybody's in an isolated area where there's not a lot of other distractions. There's not music, there's not TVs, there's not an award show, there's nothing else going on but the show itself. It's an isolated time period. It's done at a time where the audience is reasonably fresh and they haven't been sitting down for too long. Now there's 100 other things that could go into it that we could talk about, but I feel like, and I don't know if you agree, Dan, but like, I feel like if we can just get those things right, then we've kind of got half the battle.
You definitely do. I would add to, with that, getting things right to really make it successful. It's not just the timing, but making sure you have the appropriate lighting and sound. Because and it doesn't matter what time you perform, if you don't have decent lighting and you don't have decent sound, your show's not going to be very good, regardless of setting up the timing. So those three, it's, timing of when the performance is, having good sound, having the lighting, and, when possible, tell your clients that you want people sitting as close to the performance area as possible. A lot of times corporate gigs take place in hotel ballrooms. They'll have a stage set up for everything, but then there'll be like 50 feet between the stage and the tables.
The first row. Yeah. That's right. That's true. I've seen that a number of times, and it's just not ideal. here's something I've done recently. I've gone in the day before and actually help them set up. Like,
yeah,
they're in the middle of putting tables together. They're in the middle of getting materials out. So I did a little teaching and a little comedy at the same time.
yeah,
So there were other things going on, but I actually volunteered to go. I'll help you. They were asking me, Josh, how should the tables be? Which way should they face? Which way should we put your stuff? So I came in and actually helped them, and it allowed me to kind of get to know the people who are running it with me. But I also got to play a role in setting the room up, and then we walked in and we crushed.
Yeah, that's great. And I think if you're, if you're a comic listening to this and you're thinking about doing corporate gigs, we're talking about, setting corporate gigs up for success and kind of best practices. Best practice, aside from asking questions, is also listening to the needs of the client. You got to make sure, one of the things you should be asking anyway is what kind of material they want or don't want. Do they have any material restrictions? And if they do, you want to stay away from those topics. You don't want to go in there and, tell them that, hey, I'm a clean comic and get this gig. And then you come in and then you just do your raunchiest hour, because then you're not going to get booked. And just like in comedy, event planners talk, and they'll leave negative reviews and things like that. So it will impact you down the road. And going back to questions to ask, and it was just something that you mentioned, other entertainment. And that's a good question to ask too. When you're setting up a corporate, ask if there's any other entertainment and what kind that is. Because sometimes, you have these, big dinners and conferences, and this show or the whole event is like a 4-hour event. They have an hour of music, and then there's a magician, and then there's a hypnotist,
Right.
and then they're like, hey, let's do comedy. And in that scenario, I would be like, hey, I would love to go earlier if possible, because in that scenario, I think the comedian does best at the beginning, then your magician, then your hypnotist, and then your music. But that's how I see a flow like that. But, if you don't ask those questions, you show up and you're just like, you're blindsided by that kind of stuff.
That's right. It affects your performance because you're not ready. That's a good point. And, it reminds me of Nathan's story where he's like, like they were going to do comedy, but before that they were going to do a shit ton of comedy. Like it was this giant 3-hour show.
Yeah, and then they ultimately booked 2 shows and didn't tell him.
Right. So
he shows up and there's a whole nother show booked.
Right. Yeah, we're doing 2 comedy. We're doing 2.5 hours. We're doing Lord of the Rings comedy tonight. It's going to be epic.
Oh yeah. I mean, you definitely, like I said, I think if you ask enough questions, but go into those best practices off, listening to the client and letting them and ask them if they have any questions and be open to their questions, especially if they ask a question that you find that you think it's kind of annoying or dumb. Don't lead on to that. Just be, open and pleasant with them, because these people, again, corporate event planners are not the same as like a comedy producer or a music producer or whatever. They're a combination of everything. And a lot of their experience with event planning is going to be like doing corporate meetings and workshops, and entertainment can sometimes play a part of that, but it's not like the main focus. And so they don't have the skills and abilities and the know-how to make that successful. And that's why they're paying you. You're the professional. You're going to come in, you're going to ask all the right questions. You're going to give them the opportunity to ask you questions. You're going to answer them to your best ability. Once you start doing corporate gigs, you can even go a step further. When you start seeing the kind of rooms, or when you talk to them, and you one of the questions you should always ask is where the performance is. What's the venue? Oh, it's a hotel ballroom. Well, then you can go and make a little blueprint of how you would like, where you would like to have the stage and how you would like to have the tables and all that. You can basically make them a diagram, and then they can, work on trying to make it, set it up as close as possible. You got to be prepared that not every situation they'll be able to do everything how you want, because it's just not feasible. Sometimes it's a restriction from the venue or whatever it might be. And a lot of times the venue, especially corporate gigs, tends to be a hotel ballroom ran by the hotel, not by the person booked you, and so that they're at the mercy of the hotel. So there are other factors that sometimes are out of the control. But if you again just put all this information together and you do all this stuff up front and get it all worked out, you're probably looking at a 95% success rate with getting your corporates and having them be pretty good shows.
Yeah, most people are amenable to listening to you. They do see you as the expert, and when you say, "Hey, this will give us a better chance of success," chances are they'll listen.
Yeah, and I give an example, a real life example here. I'm doing in August. I'm performing at a couple's wedding, and they wanted me to do some game show style games, and like they're making a big evening of it. I'm gonna do. I'm going to be doing some of the games, and then I'm going to be doing comedy. And now they're technically, they are married already, but they're going to still have a little ceremony at this for friends and family, that kind of thing. And I'm going to be overseeing that as well. But I've had multiple meetings with them. And that's another thing you should be doing if you're doing corporates, communicate and keep that line of communication open. Whether it's email, video meetings, or a combination of all of it. That's how it was for us. But anyway, at our last meeting, they sent some ideas via email, and I sat down and I was like, okay, this is what I think with this idea that you guys have. This is how I could pull this off. With this idea, I think we do this. And they were like, yes, that sounds great, because they're letting me be the expert, because that's what I do. And and I'm pretty sure it's going to be a fun night and a pretty successful event, because they're listening and I'm keeping communication open to their needs. So keep that in mind when you're, it's a team effort. It's a collaboration process.
That's right.
And I would like to add, when you're asking, ask what type of event it is. If, just to kind of give you some ideas of some variation, this is just an extra quick tip, variations of questions. If it's some kind of a conference, asking what kind of entertainment, what kind of classes, what awards, stuff like that. If it's a holiday party, you should be asking if they're going to be giving away gifts, if there's other entertainment as well. Some of the questions you can ask at all events, but you might have to have, come up with questions that are specific to the type of event, because that'll really help. Because a lot of times, holiday parties in particular, people are only there for that free dinner and to get their prize, that they're hoping to win. And they don't care about the entertainment. And if you know that going in, you'll be able to perform and in a way where you can hopefully, avoid that and tiptoe around it.
You can appropriately set your goals.
Yeah, exactly. Right? Yeah. You can finesse. There you go. You can finesse your performance.
Yeah. Your expectations will be set. Like, okay, I'm not going to crush tonight because I'm not why people are here. Like they're here to get, lifetime achievement award or #1 real estate broker.
Yeah.
So that's what they're waiting for. And I'm between them and that. I'm going to do my best. I'm going to give a great show and be professional. I'm going to listen. I'm going to ask great questions. I'm going to follow the rules, but I'm also going to give a great performance. And I just have to kind of understand that that's how it's going to be.
Mm-hmm. Yep, exactly. All right. Well, I think that's how we really drilled into that corporate stuff. I hope you guys had your pen and paper out and you were taking some notes, because there was some good stuff there. And of course, if you have other questions, if you want more details on things or, things like that, we too welcome conversation and keep open conversation. You can email us at theartofbombingpod@gmail.com, or you could go over to Facebook and join the Art of Bombing Bomb Squad Facebook group. Ask your questions in there. There's a lot of other comedians in there too that might be able to put in their 2 cents and give some other insight. Comedy is a collaborative process. We're all trying to learn and get better together. So, all right. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back next week with a brand new episode. Till then, have a great weekend.
This has been a Dan Bublitz comedy production. Roar.